Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Doing What Matters podcast. I'm your host, Teresa McCloy.
And I'm your co-host, Erica Vinson, and we're thrilled that you are listening in today as we dive into discussions about life, business, and all the things that truly matter.
Here on the podcast, we embrace a holistic approach to living, a way of life rooted in rest, not rush. It's about connecting to our real self, our real life, and our real work, and remembering who God uniquely designed us to be and redefining success through a different lens.
So whether you're here to find inspiration, practical advice, or just a moment of connection, we're glad you're here. Let's dive into today's conversation. And today on the podcast, we are thrilled to be expanding the conversation and welcoming to the table Todd Hall. And Todd is a professor at Rosemead School of Psychology. He's a faculty affiliate at Harvard Human Flourishing Program. He's an award-winning author of Relational Spirituality and the Connected Life. And he's also the founder of Relational Spirituality Academy and spiritualmetrics.co. Todd, thank you for joining us. We're so excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Erica. It's great to be on. Really happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Todd, it is so great to have you. You and I actually just connected last year through a mutual friend of ours. So shout out to Robbie Fowler.
That's right.
And
yes.
got to spend some time together in a mastermind for just a little bit. And it was just great. That was how I first got introduced to your work. Last year, I was just looking at what's the next thing that God is inviting me to dive into. I was talking to my spiritual director about it and just saying, I love this intersection of kind of psychology and spirituality. And strangely enough, had not come across your work yet at that time, but was looking and saying, who is out there who is doing these kinds of things? And then through our mutual friend, Robbie, he just introduced me to your work. And I'm like, this is it. This is the deeper learning that I want to do in this season of my life. I know it will be impactful for me personally as I walk in my own story. I know it will be impactful for those that I coach with, and also in our coach training program that we do in certifying other coaches. So I'm just grateful, friend, that our paths crossed at the right time and the right place. So thank you.
Yes, me too, Teresa. Really glad that we got to meet then, and I appreciated getting to know you and your story and all the
Yeah.
work you're doing.
Yeah, so we've had fun. I'm actually a part of Todd's program, went through his certification. We'll talk about that at the end of the podcast, and have learned a lot just about myself and just all kinds of things. But I want to talk about your book today, and Erica and I want to just dive in because I am excited to have other people know more. I think you're like this hidden gem, Todd.
Thank you.
It's flying under the radar. And I know you have a couple of books, more than that, but a couple that you've wrote on this idea of relational spirituality. Just start there. Just talk about putting it into book form, because I do know you have two versions of the work that you've done.
Sure. Yeah. So one book is called Relational Spirituality, as you mentioned. That's an academic book with IVP. And then the other book that came out in 2021, I think. The other book's called The Connected Life. So for folks who want a little bit easier read to start with, I would recommend The Connected Life. That's a good place to start. And it has the same basic message, a little bit easier read and more stories. And then Relational Spirituality really is a deeper dive on an academic level, trying to integrate theology and psychology and neuroscience and attachment theory and these things you've already mentioned to understand how deep spiritual transformation happens. And it was a long process of writing those books, and that's part of why you just describe me as a hidden gem, which I appreciate. And part of that may be just it took a long time there was a long season of being in the desert, if you will, this work, writing, as well as doing the practical side of the work in therapy and coaching and things like that. But ultimately, it grows out of my own story and of experiencing disconnection with, I've talked about this in a number of places, growing up with a mom who struggled deeply with mental health issues, still to this day, sadly does. And so that led to a lot of disconnection. And then I became a Christian at a pretty young age, and through the influence of a pastor, interestingly, who was like a second father to me. He encouraged me to think about psychology. And so I started going down that road and started to, in college, see and experience that there were some answers I wasn't getting in the church at that time to healing and growth, and that there was this whole world of integration, as we call it, and bringing these two things together, these fields of theology and psychology. I really first was exposed to that in undergraduate at Biola, where I now have the privilege of teaching, and then went to graduate school at Rosemead School of Psychology, where I now teach, which is the School of Psychology at Biola. I really got a deep dive there in graduate school, and that kind of set me on this trajectory of, again, trying to integrate these fields, but underneath that, it was really trying to grow and heal in my own journey. That was the base of it. Ultimately, it actually started with my dissertation on this topic, and this book really grows out of the dissertation 25 years later.
I am a practical person, and I love how you take some very difficult things, because you get into psychology and theology and spiritual formation, and we could go deep down the rabbit trail on any one of these, but how you're starting to tie them all together. So much of the work that I've needed to do on my own life is to go back and revisit some story and to just look at story. And Eric and I both served as pastors in the church space. And so this idea too, that I think things are shifting and changing, and you're a part of that shift and change. There's a lot of our doctrine and theology that's just about Jesus makes it all better. We love Jesus and we don't need to go back and do the healing work. So that's been a part of my story too, as you come to that wall, that breaking point, that deep place where I've got to go back and I've got to look at patterns, look at attachments, which I want to talk about, look at some of these things. I would testify relational spirituality, very academic. For me, what's been helpful is I reconnected life, and I'm now listening to it on Audible again. So I'm in the second time through, is I have both books, and I will go, okay, I want to dive a little bit deeper. It's almost like the reference book. Erica, it reminds me of when you and I were reading Teresa of Avila. You had to have a book to read the book. So I would recommend having both, especially if you're going to work with others in this kind of work and using one as the other.
Yeah, that's great.
Let's dive down the path a little bit into, as you started looking at attachment and just this idea of a word. So we're going to jump right in. What surprised you most as you researched attachment to God and how it impacts kind of spiritual formation?
Yeah, I think one of the most striking things, just coming out of, again, my own story and then research, is how powerfully early relationships, so what we call attachment relationships with caregivers, shape our experience of ourselves and our later relationships, and also our relationship with God. And I think that's a big piece that gets missed in the church. And also that this operates at a subconscious level. So it goes deeper in a sense than our theological knowledge and what I call explicit knowledge. And so I've done my own research in this area, and there's a whole field of research on attachment to God, looking at what's the relationship between how people attach to God and attach in their human relationships. And the headline of that research is there's a pretty strong correlation that because our early attachment relationships really do shape at a deep gut level, or what I call implicit level, they shape how we feel about ourselves, how we experience our close relationships, and also how we experience God. And so I've seen that in my own research and others' research. And as an example from my own story that I share, I think I shared this in the Connected Life. So an example going back to college was a point where I remember praying, and in the midst of that prayer, realizing somehow, I don't know how I realized this, but had this sense that I had this sort of deep-seated feeling that I needed to rush through my prayer as if God had something more important to do. And at my college self level realized that. And that wasn't a conscious theological belief. It was an attachment filter that came from early relationships. And one of the kind of surprising and I think powerful findings from all this is that even people with strong biblical knowledge can struggle to experience God's love if their attachment patterns have led to insecurity and emotional blocks. And of course, I've experienced that. We all experience that to some extent, and it's really important for leaders to deal with that. And of course, we've seen far too many leaders in the church go off the rails and demonstrate this precise point, right? Where they know a lot of theology, and some of them are leaders in preaching, but internally they have not done their own work. And so there's all this pain that is unprocessed and raw, and it comes out in dysregulated ways that they're unaware of and wreaks havoc.
Yes.
I've heard the phrase pain that is not transformed is transmitted.
Yes.
And as you said that, it does apply to this attachment theory, the filters that you're talking about. So, Todd, share with us just a little bit about the attachment filters and how they continue to influence human relationships. And you've already touched a little bit on that relationship with God.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So these attachment filters or tendencies are in place by 12 months of age. So there's research using an experimental paradigm called the strange situation, where these are 12-month-old infants. And they do this experiment where they have the infant with mother, and then later did this with fathers as well. The early research was often on mothers. And so it's a toy room, there's toys around, and so they can play, and the mother's there. And then the mother leaves, and a stranger comes in, and then the mother comes back, and there's a reunion. What they look at is how the infant responds to the separation from the mother or father attachment figure, and the stranger coming in, and then also to the reunion. And it turns out the reunion was particularly the most revealing of their attachment style. And so that research, which was done by Mary Ainsworth, who worked with John Bowlby, who's the founder of attachment theory, was really the first research that kind of backed up some of these attachment tendencies that John Bowlby was talking about. And so they're broad categories, but there were some pretty clear categories, what they call secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and then later this fearful attachment. And we can see these playing out over time also. There's a strong degree of continuity over time. And so there's been a number of longitudinal studies that have tracked people over 20 to 30 years, from 12 months of age where they measure their attachment, and then when they're 25, and they see about a 70 to 75% correspondence of that attachment style. But it can change, and it does change. People can heal and grow, but it takes time and it takes new relational experiences. And as I was mentioning earlier, these attachment filters, the reason I call it a filter is because it's like a lens through which we see the world and experience relationships, in particular, close relationships. So it operates below conscious awareness and influences or shapes how we, again, feel about ourselves at a deep level, how we experience others. And one way I would say it is what we expect of important relationships at a gut level based on our past experiences. So if I've experienced, and I've seen this also with clients in therapy over and over again, clients with history of whether it's trauma or abuse or attachment insecurity, that tends to play out in their relationship with God as well as with other people, because that's the expectation they have at a gut level. This is what I experienced growing up. Things were not safe. There was abuse or there was neglect. People weren't there for me. People left. I was abandoned. And so important people in my life, including God, that's what I expect of you at a gut level. And it's often something that people can't consciously articulate, but I expect that eventually you will leave, you'll pull away, you'll reject me, whatever it is, because that's all I know at a gut level. And so that's the healing process, is helping people to have new, what I sometimes call contrast experiences that begin to rewire those attachment experiences and give them a sense that, there's actually something else possible.
Yeah.
Different kind of relationships that's actually possible. So those are the four types. Secure is the healthy type, where there's balanced relationships with appropriate vulnerability and trust. There's ability to manage one's emotions, but also reach out for help when they need it. And they value intimacy and close relationships. And so that's secure in a nutshell. Anxious attachment is when people, and by the way, I should say the insecure types of attachment are for the most part, systematic ways of protecting ourselves emotional pain from attachment figures. And there's a lot of factors that go into why people land on a certain way of coping. I don't think we will ever fully understand. I think it involves genetics and personality and environmental factors, but some people just land on, okay, the best way to cope with my parents' insecurities is this anxious attachment style or state of mind, which is to be hyper vigilant as to where they are and whether they're going to be there to protect me because they've been very inconsistent, and hyperactivate my attachment system. So I'm always on alert as to, are you going to be there for me this time or not? Because sometimes you are and sometimes you're not. And if I'm clingy and demanding, maybe then I'll get a response. Once in a while I do. And so then that shows up a lot in their other relationships. So then avoidant attachment is the opposite, with people who learned to shut down their attachment system because they learned, if I don't show or even experience my need for attachment and connection, that things go as good as possible with my parents. It's still not great, but it's a way of coping. And so they become very emotionally guarded and self-reliant, tend to cope well on the surface, but they struggle with intimacy and closeness because they get it when they're upset or distressed. They pull away, they become self-sufficient. There's a self-selection process for leaders. You look at CEOs and people like that, and even pastors to some extent, because some of those environments reinforce that, right? That you can be very bright and you can cope well on the surface, but you run into problems when it comes to really connecting emotionally and developing intimate relationships. So that's avoidant. And then fearful is like a combination of avoidant and anxious, where there's a desire for closeness, so it's not really shut down, but there's also a fear of closeness because closeness has been associated with emotional pain. And so you get this sort of chaotic back and forth, like reaching out and then pulling away type of thing. Yeah. So those are the main types. And I mentioned earlier, they're states of mind. So most people do have a dominant attachment style, but we can have different attachment tendencies with different people, and we can shift back and forth somewhat. So it's not as cut and dried as the research would suggest.
Thanks for walking through those. It was interesting when you were talking, Todd. Years ago, one of the entrepreneurial ventures that I had early on was I taught a program called Kinder Music, which was a program that children came in between the ages of about 2 years to 5 years old and did a music program with their parents. Depending on the age level we were at, sometimes the parent was in the room with them. One of the things I've thought about a lot of as I've gone through your program is watching a parent sit there and play the little instruments. And then we would put the instruments in the center of the circle for a 2-year-old to get up from their parent's lap, mother or father, and walk to the center and pick up their sticks and then come back. And I knew it because of the training that we were doing, but that was a part of the whole growth journey for the parent and the child, was letting the child do it themselves. Then they would come back, and we did a whole bunch of study on how we helped develop that relationship. And then there was a season where the parent would actually go out of the room for the 30 minutes and then come back in and experience it with them. So as you were telling that story, that whole music program was built around this idea of attachment and reattachment and this back and forth that a child is learning in those phases and those stages. I just connected with that as you were saying. Another thing I connect with, that Erica and I use this language a lot as we work with the tool. We've both done a lot of training and work with the tool of the Enneagram, and these ideas of 3 centers of intelligence, the head, heart, body, is actually my favorite part of the Enneagram. It's not to me about typing yourself and doing all these things and boxing yourself in. It's really this flow of harmony between the head, heart, body. But we use the language sometimes of how were we formed? Nature, gene pool we were given, nurture, which is what we're talking about here. There's some free will choices that come along later in our lives, but that language, there's some of those that we can control. You can't control the nature. You can't control the gene pool we were given. And I can share from my son's story, who passed away. He was adopted, both of our children. And I can remember his doctor saying to him, this is the hand you were dealt, but where does this take you in your journey, in your story? So there is so much that we all have in these nature, nurture, free will. But I love what you were saying there of, yes, secure is the healthy, but it is a rewiring. It is a creating new pathways and new river. And the brain is an amazing, God's design of the brain is the fact that we can rewire. We can create secure attachments from some very traumatic hard things. But I
Right.
would love for you to talk because I'm just curious. This is my curious brain, and I have your undivided attention, so I can ask
Yeah.
whenever I want. I would love for you to talk about that piece of not everyone has a traumatic event,
Right.
but and I'm going to use again my son's story. I remember him calling us one time from treatment and saying, Mom, there are people here that have really had some crazy hard things. And at that season of his life, he didn't feel like he had. He was raised in a loving home with loving parents, with all these things. And I would say, even as I coach and sit with a lot of people, whatever the story is that's in their head is the story that they believe, if that makes sense. Whether, their parents really weren't there for them or not. As a parent, I would like to think I was always there for my kids, but yet doesn't matter whether I was or I wasn't. Can you talk about that thought that goes on in our heads sometimes that wasn't traumatic, but yet
Mhm.
our brain took it in and it's a part of our story?
Yeah, definitely. So I think part of what you're getting at is that it all comes down to how we interpret events. That's subjective. So I was actually just talking about this in class I teach yesterday so this gets to this idea there's two ways of knowing. Explicit knowledge, implicit knowledge is based on emotion, and that's subjective. And so there's often in the church world and other contexts, oftentimes there's not a very good understanding of emotion. And so sometimes we hear the message of, hey, you can't trust your emotions. And so I think the answer to that, so when people ask me, okay, should you trust your emotions? What do we do with them? I think I tell the story in the book about when I was in college, the college pastor one time taught a lesson on you can't trust psychology or emotions in general. If you're feeling anxious or depressed, just don't give any credence to these emotions. You need to focus on what the Bible says about you, and you can't trust emotions for decision making. And so I think the real issue is, okay, what do you mean by not trusting your emotions? In one sense, yes, there's some truth to that in the sense that emotions are not an objective evaluation of reality that we should always go with, so to speak. But what it is, our experiential reading of the meaning of events to us
Yes.
based on our past experience. So one way to describe it sometimes is the emotions are like the dashboard of the soul. So it's the starting point for internal work because you can't bypass that. And so that leads to how and why we interpret events in a unique way that's subjective to us. So it may not be something that was painful to someone else or traumatic or whatever, but for whatever reason, if we interpret it as challenging or difficult or painful, it gets processed and we remember that in this gut level form of memory. And especially if it's a pattern versus a one-off event, and especially if it's an important relationship, then it has more of an impact. So yeah, I think the key there is we have to get to the subjective experience and evaluation. So another way to think about emotion or define it is it's the evaluation of meaning
Mm.
of events with respect to our well-being that is made at a subconscious level. And you can think of probably people who, and I've had clients who fit this description where they keep getting into unhealthy relationships, right? So their implicit self is one way I describe that. That's the driver operating things, the operating system of the self in a sense, right? Is saying, hey, this relationship is good for my well-being. Even though other people might say, no, it's not. And even though in their head explicitly, and I've had clients say this, like they know, yeah, no, this isn't healthy. This person is very rejecting and dismissing or even abusive maybe, but their implicit self based on their past experiences tells them this is the only thing possible. This is what it means to connect. And so in a sense, I implicitly believe that this is in my best interest. And so I'm going to get back into this relationship. And so that's the level that you have to address things at. And it does have to do with how we interpret things. And it may not be trauma per se, just emotional pain. And I think your point gets to the idea that I emphasize a lot, which is we all have insecurities, right? Even if there's not necessarily trauma, we all have insecurities. We all move toward one type of attachment insecurity or another, and sometimes a combination, especially when we become distressed or experience threat or loss. Again, subjectively, we move in that direction. So that's what I work with leaders a lot on, is encouraging them to become aware of your own story and aware of the direction you move so that you can address those issues.
This is such powerful work when we're able to, and you just talked about it, give meaning and say, okay, Brene Brown calls it the story I'm telling myself, but what meaning is attached to that? And even in these attachment filters, you've given us some language. And I'm sure for Teresa, myself, like we're noticing as we're listening and having conversation, our listeners may be noticing as well. Oh, there's something there that I am paying attention to in a fresh way. And so, how do we begin even to move forward with this new awareness to say, okay, this is something that could really expand the way that I'm able to show up in the world, in relationship with God, with others? But where do I begin?
Yeah, I think self-awareness, as we've been talking about, is a starting point to become aware of those tendencies, directions we move when we become distressed. And so do you move generally toward more avoidance and become self-sufficient, or do you move generally toward anxiety and maybe have experienced or expect abandonment, that sort of thing? And then I think some of the work is, it's finding safe people. Coaching, therapy, spiritual direction, all the above can be helpful, right? Friends, even, where you can begin to tell your story and connect the dots between these implicit experiences that get activated and where they come from in your past. So that's back to the point about the past is always the present in some sense. And we can't just say, okay, that happened in the past, it doesn't affect me. No, these things always affect us. So I think we have to go back and connect those dots. And then that process of telling our story in a safe relationship is what begins to rewire it. And the basic process that I think can happen in lots of relational contexts, like I said. So I think therapy is very important, but I don't think it's the only relational type of relationship that can help, for sure. Coaching, spiritual direction, small groups in churches. I really think this needs to be built into the church in a lot of ways. But the basic process is having these new sort of contrast experiences that causes the rewiring. And what that requires is that the painful experiences associated with these insecure attachment styles or tendencies need to come online in real time and be experienced, but in a new, safe relational context, as well as with God. And this is where contemplative prayer and contemplative spiritual practices can be so helpful, because it's not just about information and theology. It's sitting in the presence of God, contemplating scripture and letting it sink in. That's going to address this level and create this new contrast experience. And so this ties in with, this is basically the way good relational therapy works. It's also supported by some really fascinating neuroscience research that's called memory reconsolidation. And this has really only come online since about 2000, so about 25 years ago. The high-level summary of this is, before 2000, the understanding and narrative in neuroscience was, if you experience especially trauma or significant emotional pain, it gets processed by the emotional centers of the brain, like the amygdala, and it gets locked into those brain circuits. And it can never be changed. All you can do is suppress it. So that was the thinking before 2000. And that led to a lot of treatments and approaches that are referred to in that literature as competitive change. And there's actually brain research that kind of demonstrates this, right? So for example, breathing techniques, right? Wonderful, very helpful. Some cognitive behavioral types of techniques can be very helpful. But generally what they do is activate the prefrontal cortex, executive part of the brain, to suppress the amygdala and the emotional brain circuits. So it's not rewiring or changing it. It's the trauma, the pain is still there. It's just saying, okay, let's tamp that down a little bit so it doesn't take over.
Yeah, let's regulate it.
Regulate it, exactly. And that's a great first step, but we want to get to this deeper change. So back to the neuroscience story, like after 2000, they started to find in some research, originally with rats, which happens oftentimes later with humans, and which is that when the experience comes online, there is a 5-hour window in, at least in this early research with rats, right? Where then if there's a contrast experience, those brain circuits seem to unlock. It's like the brain says, okay, something different is happening. I need to pay attention. And they unlock. And then if that contrast experience is repeated enough times, it can actually be rewired.
Mm.
And that's part of the more general story of what we call neuroplasticity, which is this discovery in the last 50 plus years in neuroscience that the brain can rewire itself.
Yeah.
And like you were saying earlier, Trace, the brain is an amazing apparatus.
As you're telling that, it reminds me, we have this set of life maps that people can walk through, and many of our coaches use that in coaching and spiritual direction and things they do. And that second map, that's your life story, where you can put your story down, but remember. So my spiritual mentor, Sybil Towner, talks about that word, remember.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful word when you think of it in, it's a remembering, but in a safe environment, telling your story, allowing your story to be heard and accepted with whether that's a friend, a coach, a therapist, whatever that might be. But every time you remember your story, more of it comes online, as you say, and you get to process it. So for those of people that are out there in these helping professions, I was just thinking as you were talking about sitting with clients, and many times I just had a coaching session right before this. You get to the last 10 or 15 minutes, and all of a sudden there's an aha that happens. Sometimes we're sitting in those sessions and we're like, I don't know if we're going anywhere. I don't know. They've talked, they've shared a lot, they've brain dumped, they've done all the things, and you've asked some good questions. And then all of a sudden, there is that moment. It's a God moment where they unlock something. It comes online. Can you share a little bit, just because we have so many people that listen that do sit in those helping roles, of just the value of listening to story as they're sitting there, and what all of those are different roles. What makes it safe?
Okay, what makes it safe? Helping people feel like their emotions and their experience is understandable. I think that cuts across therapy, coaching, spiritual direction in different ways. But that's one of the things I emphasize a lot for my students in therapy, graduate students, is when they come in, when they're learning therapy early on, they, oftentimes there's this imposter syndrome and they feel they're learning, right? So it's a little nerve-wracking and they want to say something that's helpful. Oftentimes there's a desire to make a big interpretation and say something that's really brilliant and ties a bunch of stuff together. And I tell them over and over again, 80 to 90% of good therapy, and I think good coaching as well, is helping people to feel seen and understood. And that's often the first experience for people. And a big part of that is helping people put language to their experience. So helping them give words and voice to their experience. And that's taking the implicit gut level experiential knowledge and translating it into the explicit level. And that is very helpful. Another thing that I emphasize a lot is that happens fundamentally at the emotional level. So in other words, it has to do with your tone of voice, all the nonverbals, right? As well, the words you say, yes, but you can say words that sound like the right thing to say in a coaching session or therapy session, but your affective tone could be completely missing the client. You might be emotionally shut down because maybe this is reminding you of some of your stuff that's not processed and it's getting activated and whatever. And so you need to shut this down. And then the person you're working with is going to feel that at an emotional level and sense that. And that's the root level that either creates or hinders a sense of safety.
So good. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some really practical steps there and just ways of being that you named. How would you say, even for coaches, for helping professionals, ministry leaders, in assessing and really improving their own attachment security, to say, I want to show up secure so that I can be more effective in helping others? What would you say about that?
So I think there's the short-term game and the long-term game, right? So the short-term is doing some work before you go into a session to just ground yourself, calm yourself, whatever helps you to be emotionally present, right? So that could be some contemplative practices, some meditation, That's, I think, important and helpful. But the long-term game, I think, is like we were talking about earlier, just being in some kind of process where you're doing your own internal work with your own story on an ongoing basis and I think that needs to be relational. Again, it can be different kinds of relationships, but somebody in your life could be a spiritual friendship where there's a focus there, but it could be spiritual direction, a coach, a therapist, where you're sharing your story, processing your story, and working toward security, because that's what's going to help you work toward security is feeling, again, accepted and known in your experiences and stories, and then gaining self-awareness and understanding what direction do I tend to move in terms of attachment when I get stressed? Where does that come from? And that can help me to regulate it and manage it and be able to focus on the other when I'm doing coaching or therapy. So I think there's a longer term process that needs to be in place, and being in community and regularly practicing spiritual disciplines.
And practical things are always necessary, right? Like I think that's why I was drawn several years ago when I really hit that wall into spiritual rhythms and spiritual practices. Wasn't how I was probably brought up in my faith journey. Some basic things, but not the depths of some of the things that you have mentioned. What does silence and solitude hold? I think for so many leaders and those that show up in the helping professions that we've mentioned, having quiet time, having time away. Yeah. So I want to wrap up some things, Todd. I'm sitting here going, oh, I would just love to do a whole podcast series. So if you're ever up for that, like,
Sure. Yeah.
let's do 6 or 8 just episodes, because there's so much here that ties. And a lot of the language that I use is this idea of living in a place of rest, not
Uh-huh.
rush. And I often describe rest as an internal thing that you actually can carry with you all the time. It's not a vacation. It's not oh, let me get away from my day to day.
Yeah.
That deep internal work and it's done in relationship. And there's some ways that we can measure that. Do I have healthy relationships? That's the R for me. Do I have full circle energy, this head, heart, body connection? Do I slow in intentionally? That's the S. And then how is my time coming out purposefully? Am I choosing things that are purposeful, or is life happening to me? Or am I choosing
Mhm.
life that God has wired and designed? So that framework, REST, I think that's some of what we're talking about here at a deep level is people desire to say, the phrase we use in the culture here in the United States a lot is, I'm so busy. And we wear it in this honor badge and
Right.
all of these things. And we judge others. People say it to me all the time. You're so busy. And I'm like, I'm not. I am living a full and rich and abundant life.
Yeah.
And I still have the energy to do lots of things, but they don't know how much time I spend quietly or alone or in other places. So for you, because I think I want to know, what does Todd Hall do in his everyday ordinary life? In this last week, how have you chosen to really make that decision? Because I do think it's a decision or a discernment. It could have been a
Mhm.
discernment of how you're going to do your life now. How do you choose to live in a state of rest, not rush?
It's an interesting timing for this question because this semester, I operate my life on semesters as a professor, right? And this semester has been more busy than usual, so it's been more of a challenge. So I think one thing is it's just an ongoing battle and choice to just prioritize rest and practices that kind of promote that. And so what I try to do, and it has been more of a struggle, but I'm, yeah, trying to prioritize in the morning, spending some time in contemplative prayer. And so I have a little YouTube video that just walks through some contemplative practices. And it really is helpful to reset me and ground me in a sense in God's presence and remind me that He has purpose for me and to be aware of that and that He's with me during the day. So it really does slow me down. And then there's a part of it where I use typically the Jesus prayer. And so that'll be kind of my meditations, just to repeat the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. That helps also to ground me. And then there's a portion of it that's gratitude, and then some kind of request supplication. But the gratitude part is really helpful as well, to just continue to, just on a daily basis, but over time, a pattern of looking for the things that I have to be grateful for to help develop a habit of focusing on those things and being oriented toward them rather than the things that I'm lacking and that sort of thing. So I try to prioritize that in the morning, reading scripture, and then also doing some other reading, which is important as a professor, but also happily, I really enjoy reading and find that also really helps me to feel centered and grounded. And if I miss that for a while, I feel off kilter and fragmented if I'm not reading and having time to reflect. So an ideal day for me is, first of all, get enough sleep. That's really important. And then solid hour to an hour and a half on my patio right here, doing these things I've just described before jumping into the day. And so that really helps me to approach the day with more of a sense of emotional presence. The other thought that came to mind as you're asking that is, I feel like a lot of this, when you talk about busyness and that sort of thing, I think I've come to realize like it's a matter of faith in a way to hold the boundary to engage in these practices, because there's always one more thing you can do. My to-do list is like never ending. And so it's a matter of faith to remind myself, okay, God does not need me to do all these things, or he's not going to be able to accomplish his will in the world somehow. He's got it. I get to participate, but I don't have to do all these things. And if I'm having to work ridiculous hours, that's not good for me or anyone else in terms of how I show up for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talk about that all the time in the work that we do, of what's the deeper story or the deeper, I call it the crazy tape that plays in your head. What's the tape that's playing in your head of I'm not enough, I don't have enough, all those things of it's usually that enoughness. And yet God is enough and he doesn't need us to do any of this. And that's a story in itself, right? You don't need me to accomplish your way in the
Right.
world and all of those things. So there's so much there. Thank you for giving us, though, a glimpse into the real everyday life of Todd Hall, because even as you say, so many times what people see is only what they see of you out in the world or what they see of me or see of Erica. And they only see us in the doing.
Yeah.
Because the being is our sacred space. The rest is our sacred time. And so to hear you say, no, I spend an hour and a half for the most part. That was my desire, to be with God in the mornings. And I do use technology to have a YouTube video that walks me through some things. And then I have this other way of being in gratitude and other things. I think that's so encouraging to people to go, you may not have an hour and a half, depending on your season of life, but to go, there's a behind the scenes that happens in all of us that are living from rest, not rush. So thank you for that glimpse
Yeah. You're welcome.
into the everyday. I'm serious about, there's so much I want to explore always. It's why I'm a part of the work that you do and in your community and your different things. Erica, why don't you share with us, where can they connect with Todd more? Where could we get with him more? Or maybe Todd, you want to share for yourself. However, we want to make sure that comes online in this episode.
Sure.
Yeah, Todd, I know you have some opportunities coming up. How can they connect with you and the work that you're doing?
So got a couple websites. One is relationalspirituality.co. And so that's the Relational Spirituality Academy that you referred to, Teresa. And so I run a coaching program, the Relational Spirituality Coaching Certification. So people can go to that website and jump on the wait list for that. We also have a community we just launched in January. So probably in the summer, we'll open that up again. And so that's for people who want ongoing training and contact and resources for coaching from this relational spirituality perspective. So they can contact me there through the website, and the books are all on that website as well.
I would say this, whether you're listening in and you are a leader, you are a CEO, you are an entrepreneur, someone in the helping profession, this work is the work for your own self first, and then continue that journey because you're all relating to others. This is about relationships and being in those healthy relationships. So I can't say enough about the work that Todd is doing and my gratitude even for connecting with him and having him as a part of my life and my ongoing learning. It helps me in my own work and also in my own being. So it comes on both sides for me, Todd. So thank you so much. Also, a lot of what we talked about today connects to the work that we do here at the Real Life Process and how we come alongside you in developing this rule of life. And so connect with us. You can go to thereallifeprocess.com for more information. We have free community, all those types of things. But we would encourage you, as we do each and every episode, to remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. So we'll be back next week. Erica, Todd, thanks for being with me today.
Thank you so much, Teresa. It's great to be on with you.
It was great to be in this moment with both of you.